Now, the Communication Ministry is hinting of plans to implement some provisions in the Electronic Communication Act, which legalizes the clampdown of fake news on social media. Sector Minister Esla Owusu-Ekufo says the dissemination of fake news is affecting lives and destroying content generated by traditional media.
The content of that legislation depends on all of you as practitioners. And it is not enough to sit by and watch the process unfold without taking active part and interest in it, and then later criticizing what you had an opportunity to make an input into. So, can't say that what has happened is good, but there's a silver lining to every cloud. If for nothing at all, the imperative of having a set of regulations to guide the content that we produce is now apparent to all of us. And I believe that as men and women of goodwill, we will work together to ensure that we serve our nation well in this area as well. And while we're at it, we need to look at the ease with which fake news is also spreading around us based on the social media platforms that we have. And now there's a convergence between traditional and new media. And the lines are blurred because you, the traditional media practitioners, are taking your content from social media and vice versa. So the rules which guide traditional media must also be crafted in such a way that it can also guide the new media as well. How do we do that? We need to think through, look at best practices from around the world, and see how we can sanitize this space so that what we read on new and social media we can accept as largely credible. If the proliferation of fake news undermines the integrity of the work that you do, you will be the losers, because it will only breed skepticism and cynicism about the content of the media, the information that is published out there. And ultimately, it will affect your output. So let's all work together to see how we can use the current tools at our disposal. And there's something in the Electronic Communications Act which makes it possible for us to pull down content that is false, misleading, or criminal, broadcast on electronic platforms. It's there. We've never used it. But it's time for us to look at, and I'm sure that the legal director of the NCA in his presentation will deal with some of these issues.
Esla Owusu-Ekufo, the Minister for Communication. Meanwhile, government has set up a 13-member committee to monitor and recommend for sanction media houses in breach of ethical content. Information Minister Kojo Oppong-Nkrumah says the sanctions include withdrawal of licenses.
In particular, the framers of our Constitution and our forebears had a special place for media in our democracy and our national life. Over the years, Ghana has worked to deepen these freedoms by, for example, repealing the Criminal Libel Law, and quite recently, enacting a Right to Information Act aimed at providing a freer space for public discourse. Colleague ministers, invited guests, a 2020 Afrobarometer report released by the Center for Democratic Development, CDD, suggests that the majority of Ghanaians support media freedoms in Ghana. Therefore, we all have a collective responsibility to ensure that the media continues to operate freely, to ensure that the media freedoms are protected, and more importantly, to ensure that the emerging threats to media practice in Ghana are kept. One such threat is the sharp rise of content described as unwholesome or inappropriate by various segments of the Ghanaian society that are popping up on our broadcasting platforms. These include, but are not limited to, the constant portrayal of money doubling on our television, the regular seeming promotion of social vices and even sometimes criminal activity, including ritual murders, pornography, and advertising of unapproved products on our broadcasting platforms. A number of questions come up. Fundamentally, there's a question of what qualifies as inappropriate content on our screens or on our broadcast platforms. Secondly, There's a question of who determines what is inappropriate. Thirdly, there's a question of how this determination is made. Fourthly, what remedies are currently available or ought to be made available in the near future. A fifth item is what are the current legal tools available for dealing with challenges of this nature, assuming we agree that these are challenges that must be dealt with. How do we ensure that such tools are not abused by persons who may seek to claw back on our cherished media freedoms? How do we get regulators to use the current legal framework and to protect the public and even the media itself from inappropriate or supposedly inappropriate content? If there has ever been the need to take up this challenge, the time is now. The last time the National Media Commission attempted to enact a legislative instrument to address these emerging challenges, the LI was shot down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and perhaps rightly so. But within the current body of laws, among regulators, we believe there's room to find common ground to deal with some of these emerging challenges, even as we prepare to properly legislate in the area of broadcasting. Honorable Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, another set of matters worth considering are the proposals that have been put forth for the soon-to-be enacted broadcasting law. After several years of consultation and engagement, the time has come for us to conclude our conversations on what is currently the bill and proceed to lay same before Parliament, hopefully for passage. However, some emerging issues, such as the following, are coming up and should engage our attention in these final parts of our consultation.
Kojopon Nkrumah is Minister for Information. Suleiman Abrahima is Executive Director of the Media Foundation for West Africa. He's joining me on the phone right now. Mr. Abrahima, thank you for your time. Good afternoon. Let me start by taking your initial assessment of how government has gone about this particular bill and the quest to make it law in the processes that are ongoing currently and the matters arising. Let's start with your initial assessment.
Well, thanks for having me. I think that the process, I would say, has been great. We are in an era where participatory lawmaking is the way to go. The broadcasting bill has been on the table for close to 2 decades now. And so if we've gotten to a point where we now want to activate it, I think the right thing to do is what is happening by way of bringing stakeholders and actors together and brainstorming together so that at the end of the day, we can build consensus on what would work and what would not work.
Okay.
And this is critical because doing this involves trying to define a very thin line around preserving the freedoms that our Constitution guarantees, and at the same time making sure that those freedoms are exercised in ways that would not compromise our democracy, would not compromise the progress of our society in any way. So there's a fine line around censorship and responsible conduct among media practitioners. And so I think it's been a great process so far. It's just the beginning, but this is how it will go. I'm sure that at the end of the day, we would all have a piece of legislation that will serve the common interest of our people.
Let's take a look at the details now. Must media practitioners at this point be worried about what appears, as they put it, to be the possible use of either the proposed broadcasting bill or the current Electronic Communication Act to regulate media content?
Well, not at all. I think that media practitioners or media organizations would by now appreciate the fact that if only you would want to be professional, if only you would want to do the business of journalism, then an unregulated environment is actually a threat, rather than having a regulation that would sort of help refine the context and refine the ecosystem for all of us to practice in an atmosphere of decorum. So if you talk about the Electronic Transactions Act or Electronic Communications Act or the NCA Act, which empowers the NCA to take certain decisions or remedial action, these are laws already. So even without the broadcasting law that is being worked on, if the NCA decides that they would want to apply the law as required by it, I'm sure nothing stops them, except that, of course, on matters of content and all of that, the NCA would then lack the capacity to be able to act. So I guess what is happening is, look, we started this regime in 1993, liberalized the airways. At the time, we had just one radio station, a state monopoly. We got into this liberalized environment without, working around what it is that we needed to do. And I think under the circumstance, as you say, it's better late than never. And so it's right that we approach it now.
As we approach it now, like you said, there has to be space for genuine mistakes. There has to also be the guard against a deliberate attempt by people in government to clamp down on certain media organizations that they don't necessarily agree with. Those are some of the concerns that have come up. What advice will you give, especially for those who are a part of the consultative process, as the critical areas to pay attention to?
Well, I think that, as I said, no one should entertain fears about the process. If only you would want to do good journalism. I think the process is actually one that will further enhance the freedoms that are guaranteed. We all do have to recognize that Article 164 of our Constitution, even as 162 and all the subsections under it, provides for the guarantees and all of that. 164 also made a provision that we needed to have a piece of legislation that would ensure that in our practice, we do it in such a way that it would adhere to the principles of morality, principles of public order, and so on and so forth. The other great thing is that this is not a government that is going to, it's not an action that is going to be undertaken by government. It is something that is coming under the statutory regulatory body that we all have been working with, which is the National Media Commission, which is an independent commission. And I believe that at the end of the day, no one will be happy to have the commission begin to take certain actions that would undermine the freedoms that we are supposed to all have. If anything at all, I think the decisions would be ones that would further enhance the freedoms that the media must have. And the fact that the Constitution says no censorship, I don't think that this would be a mechanism to begin to have the NMC try to censor content and so on and so forth. So I think it's a process that we should all abide by. As I did say, we should have done this way back. We have slept on the job to a point where we have almost been overwhelmed by the situation. But the steps that are being taken, I believe, are the right steps. And going forward, we should be able to correct what we have failed to correct in the past.
The Communication Minister, in addressing the consultative stakeholders meeting, indicated that we have to find a way of applying the part of the law that allows us to pull down content that are deemed false, that are deemed misleading, etc. I know that it is clear when something is false, it is clear. But I give you the typical example about the new, if you like, the grading that came up from the World Bank about Ghana not being a middle income status and all the brouhaha that came around it. For issues that have, very blurred lines of clarity when it comes to categorization of fake news or whatever it is. How do we regulate all of these without necessarily taking people on when they've made genuine mistakes?
Well, it's a very complex issue when you now get into the terrain of digital and platform communication. A lot of countries are currently struggling with that. Germany tried to be a pioneer in this field when in 2017, in June 2017, their Bundestag passed what they called the Network Enforcement Act 2017, which came into force in January 2018. But soon after it came into force, it was realized that it was quite complex than perhaps the government in Germany had thought, because there were obligations on the part of platforms like Facebook, Google, or YouTube to to take down content. And it almost became like, well, the law is empowering these platforms to become censored. And that was not the intention. Other countries, which try to follow up, Russia and a few other countries referencing the German law, also realized that it's quite a complex thing. In the conversation that we had last week, I think there were insinuations about what we could possibly do with the emerging issues around fake news, false information, and so on and so forth. And my position was that it is practically impossible to try and cater for all those issues within a single broadcasting legislation. And I believe that if you take the UK example, where in 2019 they tried to have a digital oversight body. And in the end, there was a conversation and a discussion around whether it should be part of the Ofcom, which is the broadcasting authority, or they should have a separate digital authority to deal with matters of digital issues, matters of fake news, and so on and so forth. I would go with the latter, that perhaps we are at a point where we need to have a conversation whether we must have a separate body that would be responsible for dealing with matters of content, matters of digital platforms, so the Facebook posts, the YouTube posts, and so on and so forth. I don't think that at this stage we can have all that being catered for in a single broadcasting legislation. And it's a complex thing. We need to give it time as we go on. We need to learn more about it. We need to study the trends. People are doing OTT broadcasting. People are sitting in the US and broadcasting over the net and are targeting Ghanaian audience and so on. So even if you have a piece of legislation here, what do? Are you going to empower the NCA to say, look, you can take down certain URLs or you can block certain content? Are you going to say to Facebook, look, if you don't take down this content, we are going to impose a fine? Would Facebook budge, given that we are a tiny country and in terms of our contribution, not much? So that requires its own conversation. But I believe that if somebody sits on TV now and say they are doubling money, they are giving lotto numbers, they are spiritualists, and so on and so forth, those are not matters that we have to continue to wait. And I believe the committee that is envisaged to be established by the National Media Commission would be so powered to be able to deal with matters like that.
Mr. Brima, I say a very big thanks to your time. Thanks for your time. This is still a conversation that we can have subsequently, looking at the content, what's going in it, and what can be done by the key stakeholders. Thank you. Suleiman Brima heads the Media Foundation for West Africa there.